Today we're going to make biscuits, baking powder biscuits. And biscuits are different than yeasted breads because they have fat incorporated into the dough, and you want that fat to evaporate in high heat. We're not going to be mixing these biscuits really vigorously. We don't want to develop the gluten like we did in yeasted breads. We also are using baking powder in these biscuits. And baking powder needs two things to be activated. It needs liquid and it needs heat. So we need to make sure that our dough is wet enough. So I have 2 cups of white flour, but you can use any kind of flour. This is all-purpose white flour. 1 tablespoon of sugar, but again, you can use any kind of sweetener. 1/2 teaspoon of salt. 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon of baking powder. 1/4 cup of shortening. You can also use butter. And 1 cup of buttermilk. The recipe calls for a scant cup of regular milk. I'm going to use buttermilk in this recipe, and I need to use a little bit more because the buttermilk is thicker than regular milk. You can also use almond milk, cream, whatever you like, whatever kind of liquid you want to add to it. I'm going to do this recipe half and half. The first half I'm going to make into regular biscuits, regular cut up biscuits, and I have 2 biscuit cutters here, a small one and a bigger one. And then I'm going to roll out the dough and make some biscuit roll-ups, some sweet biscuit roll-ups. I also have a pastry blender, which I'm going to cut the shortening in with. I have my spoon, I have my knife for when I make the biscuit roll-ups, and I have a mini spatula to help scrape out the bowl. So let's get started. I'm going to dump in all of my dry ingredients, my flour, my sugar, my salt, and my baking powder. And I'm just going to stir that together, just a little bit, just to mix it up. You can also put it through a sifter if you like. We're going to take the shortening or the butter, whichever you choose to use, and we're going to cut it in. And cutting in means we're just going to break it into tiny, tiny pieces. You can do this in a food processor. Also, we're cutting that shortening into tiny, tiny pieces, and each piece is getting coated with flour. It doesn't have to be perfect. That's good. And then we're going to add the liquid. And as we add the liquid and stir that in, we're not going to stir vigorously. We're going to kind of stir and fold. Trying to get all of that flour wet, but not really stir it like you would bread dough or a cake. I'm also cutting across the dough, trying to open up any spots that might be wet, that need to soak up some more flour. All right. So the dough is wet. I'm going to take a pastry cloth, and you can use a piece of wax paper, you can use a pastry cloth or board. You can also use just the countertop, and I'm going to put a little bit of flour on it. And just pull that dough out onto my pastry cloth. Now, you want to just kind of push the dough together, knead it, just not knead it like bread, but just kind of push it together. I'm going to use the pastry cloth itself because the dough is kind of sticky, until I can get in there and just kind of fold it over and make sure it's a cohesive dough. I'll just roll it onto itself. There, so we've got a nice soft ball of dough. It's not pushed together like bread dough, it's just kind of all cohesive. I'm going to cut it in half so that we can do 2 different things with this dough. The first thing I'm going to do is pat or roll this to about 1/2 inch. And then I'll cut some biscuits out of it. I'm going to use my smaller biscuit cutter. You can reform the dough to make more biscuits. And I'm putting those on a baking sheet. If you bake them on a cookie sheet without a baking sheet, you don't need to grease the pan. All right, and I'll add this dough to our biscuit roll-ups. A little more flour. All right, I'm gonna roll this dough out. It's a little wet, so I'm making sure that both my rolling pin and my pastry cloth have flour on them. I'm rolling it about twice as thin as the biscuits were. Then I'm going to take some brown sugar, and you can use a savory filling. You can use like not the crumbles, the sausage crumbles that are vegetarian. You can use ground beef. You can use vegetables and cheese. I'm going to make this a sweet one, and I'm just going to put brown sugar over this whole thing. I'm going to use my pastry cloth to get me started in rolling this up. And I'm just going to roll this. Tuck the ends under a little bit. And this is where my big knife comes in. I'm going to cut about an inch and a half rings out of that biscuit dough. I'm going to tuck the ends underneath, and those are going to go on the cookie sheet too. Doesn't matter if a little bit falls out. You can also fill them with jam. While we're doing this, my oven is heating to 450 degrees. Because remember, baking powder likes that heat. And also, that heat is going to take the shortening that's in that dough and just evaporate it really quickly and give us a nice, hopefully, a nice fluffy biscuit. So here are our biscuits. They've been baking at 450 degrees. We've got our sweet biscuits over here, our sweet roll-ups, and then our regular raised biscuits here. I mixed up a little bit of glaze. It's just confectioner's sugar and water. And just for a little bit of a treat, I'm gonna glaze the sweet biscuits, not the regular biscuits, just the sweet biscuits. Give them a little bit of a streusel. You don't have to by any means. It's just a little extra added touch. So let's see what those look like in the middle. They're hot, but I think you can see there's lots of good sweetness there inside. I'm pretty happy with these biscuits. They could have raised a little bit more. Maybe I would want to roll them a little bit thicker next time. If we break them open, you can see that they're nice and fluffy inside. And so we're going to eat these with maybe a little bit of butter. The butter's cold and the biscuit's hot. That's what makes life good. Cold butter on a hot biscuit. And then maybe we'll add a little bit of honey. Or we'll cover them with chicken and gravy. So there's a biscuit. Or maybe a little bit of raspberry jam from last year's berry bushes. And there we have some baking powder biscuits.